So I was kind of an odd bit of thoughts this week. This week I was kind of curious about fear. What is it that creates fear for us? And fear can come from a lot of places. And so I looked up what some of the most common fears are, what some of the most common phobias are. And you might expect, they're the ones you would expect. Like some people are afraid of heights. Interestingly, there are some people who are not afraid of heights, but are afraid of flying. I guess apparently around 20, 30,000 feet, height starts to matter, I suppose. I think it's probably the loss of control, though, right? Is that absence of control? Some people are afraid of different critters. Some people don't like spiders. Some people, like my wife, don't like snakes. Although I will tell you, I hiked in New Hampshire for 10 years, never saw a snake. Every time I hike with her, we find a snake. Every time. We go kayaking, we find a snake. I'm not making any of that up. And then, of course, during the pandemic, another kind of phobia that people have had to face are needles. Right? As we've gotten our various vaccines, we had to deal with needles. But it's interesting, among the biggest phobias that people face are actually something that I have to do all the time. We often talk about public speaking. And it turns out that, based on the things I'm reading, is that public speaking isn't really its own phobia anymore. They now have what they call social phobias that actually include a number of different things. Public speaking falls in that. But the reason they kind of link them together is because they believe that there's a common concern, is that many of us are afraid of making mistakes publicly. We're afraid of being judged for our choices or our mistakes or the things we don't do quite right. And I get really used to being judged for doing things wrong, because I get to do it in front of people all the time. And it's funny, and one of the things I want to admit to you this week is I actually made a mistake last week. Last week I said we were ending this series, but we're not. And the thing is, the reason that happened is that I had a bunch of conversations this week that brought a number of issues to mind that were kind of related to what we've been talking about. Is that I talked to some people, and some of the things that people were bringing up, the things that they were struggling with, and kind of tying into this idea of fear, realized kind of tied in really closely to what we've been talking about. So the thing to remember that in this series, what we've been talking about is fundamentally the kind of life that Jesus promised. That this promise that we could have this full, meaningful, impactful life. Yet in practice, many of us don't feel like we're having that. And I do think that as we get older, we start to let go of the hopes of that sometimes. Or even if we had a period in our lives where things were impactful, we kind of start to get later in life and we start to feel like maybe that time for us is done. But I don't think that's the case. I think that no matter where we are in life, young, middle-aged, older, I think there's still a lot of opportunity to have impact in our lives and actually do things that are really, really important and really make a difference. So as we go along, I kind of want to launch off of last week to kind of set up things this week. Remember that last week, our focus was this idea that direction of travel, right? And we kind of built that off this quote, right? Direction, not intention, determines your destination. I'll say it again, right? Direction, not intention, determines your destination. And what we mean by that is that intending to have an impactful life, intending to make a difference, intending to do something important, doesn't cause it to happen. Right? We actually have to move in a direction consistent with that. We have to do things that give us that opportunity. And as we talked about that, we looked at this narrative from the book of Joshua. Remember that Joshua was a person who found himself suddenly in charge. That he had been part of this group of people who had been following Moses towards what they called the Promised Land. That there was this place where there was this life that God had said was available. And everyone thought that Moses was going to be the guy to lead them in. But then, as the years wore on, eventually, Moses dies. And just as they're about to make the turn in to get there, Joshua finds out that he's the guy in charge. And he's the one now responsible for leading everyone. And that's not what he expected to have happen. And then to make things even more interesting, it's like, congratulations, Joshua, you're in charge. Go that way. And there's a huge roaring river in the way. And so what did they do? They look at this river. It's a fast-moving river. There's no way to get across. So they took steps of faith. They approached the river. They took a few steps in. They took the steps that they could, believing that God would make a way. And as they did that, things fell into place, and they were able to cross. Now, that is a great narrative. And it demonstrates that when we have faith and we take steps of faith, that things do fall into place. But what if in your life you're facing your own roaring river and you embrace faith and you take those few steps into the water and the river doesn't change and the river continues to flow? In fact, nothing seemed to change. What do we do then? Does that mean that if we took those steps of faith and nothing happened, does that mean that we've gotten it all wrong? If you step into the water and it continues to roar by, does that mean that it's time to give up? I distinctly believe the answer is no. That the key to having a life like Jesus talks about is being persistent, that we have to carry on. Because the thing that we need to remember is that as we look at this Joshua story, that moment of crossing the river was a moment in a very long journey. A journey that had been filled with many challenges for years, with many obstacles that they really had to struggle with. And if you continue to reading the book of Joshua, they still have a lot of struggles ahead as well. And what that really means then is that as we go through this journey we call life, we will have moments where things fall into place and the outcomes of our faith are immediately obvious. But we will also have lots of moments where we walk in faith and at any given moment, it doesn't feel like things are falling into place. But the key is to remember that it's a journey. Just like the Joshua narrative is a long journey with these big moments of victory surrounded by lots of challenges. Life is a journey with moments of victory surrounded by lots of challenges. And the thing is that was kind of my realization this week, as I was really thinking through kind of all the things we've talked about over the past 4 previous weeks and all the things that I've been reading as I've been doing my study and my prep. A key thing to recognize is that the life that Jesus describes, that rich, full, impactful life, is distinctly about never being finished. Recognizing that life is not about reaching a point where you've done so much that you get to stop now. Right? It doesn't mean that you don't have to make changes. It doesn't mean that you don't leave your profession and move into other things. But life as a whole is about continuing on and doing what comes next. That the kind of life that Jesus describes can only be experienced by recognizing that it is a journey where we never fully arrive. That yes, there will be goals along the way. In fact, we need to have goals along the way. And as we hit those goals, we should celebrate those goals and take time to enjoy those goals. And then start moving again. And keep going on. Because if we stop moving, we stop growing. So, when we talk about the kind of life that Jesus describes, we need to understand that a destination is not a place. A destination is not something that we do. Walking in the kind of life that Jesus describes, our destination is who we become. That our journey through life is about growth and becoming who we've been created to be in line with this call that God has put on our lives to actually start impacting the lives around us. And the thing that we have to remember is that if we start to realize that our life is about who we become, how we grow as we transform as a person, then that means that everything that we experience in life is part of what shapes us as to who we become. The good things and the challenging things, they all shape who we become. And so as we talk about this, the thing that I want to really focus on here is this idea that we need to follow through, right? We're meant to follow through in our lives, is that we're meant to keep going and keep doing what we can do. Because if we're honest with ourselves, if we're really honest with ourselves, we all like the times best when things are going well, when they're going just the way we want them to. But also, if we're honest with ourselves, when do we grow? It's during the challenges. And I understand that some of you have had incredibly difficult challenges, more difficult challenges than anyone should have to face. But it's through the challenges that we begin to change. And it's through the challenges that we start to develop a closer relationship with ourselves, get more honest with ourselves, and we're able to talk to ourselves, although some of us may talk to ourselves too much already, I don't know, but actually, have a healthy dialogue in our mind is what I mean by that. But also it impacts our relationship with God, right? That as we deal with challenges, we kind of have a chance to decide that we're either going to turn our back on our relationship with God or embrace our relationship with God. And so with that in mind, I think it's important to recognize that God does not abandon us in our challenges, even the big ones. In fact, if we look at the Old Testament author Isaiah writes some things from the perspective of God. And what Isaiah says is, when you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. Now, something that's really important to understand when we read that, when you look at ancient Hebrew writing, whenever you see things like the sea, deep water, raging waters, they're actually metaphors. They actually represent chaos, challenges, difficulty. So basically, it's saying that, well, God is with you in those things. But there's also more that it's saying. If it's saying that God is with us in those moments, what it also says is expect those moments throughout our lives. Right? Throughout our lives, we will have difficulties. We will have disorder, and we will feel like we have gotten things wrong sometimes. But when we're in that, know that you're not alone, that God is in it with you. And sometimes it does not feel like it. But God is in it with you. And it's in overcoming our challenges. And sometimes overcoming a challenge simply means being able to get out of bed the next day and just face another day. Sometimes that is overcoming the challenge. But as we do that, and as we seek God in our challenges, that's when we start to grow in our relationship with God. We start to learn to lean on God, maybe a little bit more than we used to be willing to. And one of the things that I wanted to really address very directly is that sometimes when we experience difficulties in our lives, we can sometimes feel like it's something that God is inflicting on us. And sometimes well-meaning people will say that, well, you need to look at what's going on in your life as you do this. But I don't believe that. I don't believe God inflicts things on us. I think the challenges in our life come from many sources. Most of those challenges are that things happen, right? We live in a broken world. We are broken people interacting with other broken people. And a lot of the things that go bad are just a result of that. Life is hard. right? Jesus kind of warns us, hey, I've come to save the world, but you will have tribulation, right? He warns us of that. And so I think that's where a lot of the challenges come from. There are times in our life where maybe some of the challenges we're experiencing are the natural outcome of actions, though. Right? If we have a chemical dependency, an alcohol dependency, if we're not getting help with that, if we're not facing that, well, there's going to be turmoil in our lives. Right? If we're running our businesses in a dishonest way, or we're in a dishonest relationship, well, there are going to be natural outcomes that come from that. If we've got secrets in our lives that we're hoping no one will find out, someday someone will. And those are the natural outcomes of our actions. But they're not God inflicting things on us. I don't think any of us deserve it. A lot of things just happen. But as some things happen, we just want to look at our choices, our decisions that led up to that moment. Because the one thing that I am absolutely certain of is that God is for you. God is on your side. God wants you to do well. And so, as we go through challenges, there's this opportunity to kind of lean into God, and as we connect with God, allow God to lead us towards transformation. Because again, it's during challenges that we start to grow, or it's during challenges that we start to become stronger. It's during challenges that we start to become emotionally stronger, intellectually stronger, sometimes physically stronger, depending on what the challenge is. But I think the key thing that happens in challenges in life is there's a chance to start to change our thinking, to consider new ways of doing things. That oftentimes we experience challenges that are not our fault. But that doesn't mean we don't have an opportunity to adapt and actually move on in a different way. Because again, if things are going well, we're not really going to be that motivated to change. It's when we encounter those challenges in life that we start to become motivated to change. And I think the thing is that it's in those challenges that we start to become open to a new direction. Right, to start moving in a new direction. To have that life that Jesus describes, we've got to grow, right? We've got to change. We're not meant to reach a point in our lives and become static. We're meant to keep growing. And so if we look at what Isaiah says again, Isaiah continues and says, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. And that's something I think that we have to really be open to. That we have a tendency to fall into a pattern of thinking. You know, we often use the language old thinking, but I think that's more pejorative than it's meant to be. It's just that we kind of keep thinking the way we always have. And if we keep thinking the way we always have, we're going to stay where we've always been. And also a key part of not dwelling on our past is not letting our past mistakes own us. Right? If we've done things that we wish we hadn't have done, well, own up to them and then carry on. Right? That is a key step in freedom. It's something we talked about earlier in the series, that you've made your mistakes, do the best you can with them, and then carry forward and leave them behind. God leaves them behind. There's no reason for you to carry them with you as well. Right? Find that freedom. Because then as God continues, he says, right, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Now, as we read that, is it possible, just posing a question, is it possible that there are times in our life when things aren't working because we're stuck in old thinking? Is it possible that we keep looking at things the way they were as opposed to the way they are? Or is it possible that we're looking at things the way we wish they were as opposed to the way they are? Because the thing I think that Isaiah is pointing out here as he writes is that as we go through our lives, we need to constantly be open to doing new things. We need to constantly be open to new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking. And I mean that in our personal lives as well as a church. that we have to constantly be willing to evaluate what's happening in our lives and say, is this still working, or do I need to think about something new? Because I do believe that God presents new opportunities to us all the time and new ways to get to things all the time. And I think that God is constantly trying to nudge us in a direction that is healthier and better for us, and an opportunity to do more in this world around us. Because the thing I think is really important for us to remember, and whether we're talking about this metaphorically as well as in reality, if you were to have a path in the woods, well, that path over time is familiar and comfortable. It's a well-worn path. You know where it goes. But eventually, all the resources on that path get used up. Eventually, all the vegetation's been trampled down and there's nothing but dirt there anymore. And if we keep walking in that same old path, we keep walking on the same old dirt, and eventually all we find is dirt. If we want to find new resources, if we want to find new opportunities, we want to find new chances to grow, new chances to have an impact, then we need to be willing to travel to a new path. And I think that a big part of the way we find new paths is by those challenges that we face that we sometimes don't get through. There's times where I'm saying that I'm trying to go this way, I'm trying to do this thing, and it's just not working. So maybe I need to try another way to achieve that, or try to find another way to go forward. So the question is that how do we figure that out? Okay, if the direction I'm heading in is not working, or if the direction I'm trying to travel towards is not the way to travel, how do I figure out my new direction? How do I find my way to the new place? How do I find my way to live that life that Jesus describes, that life that Jesus has said is available? Well, I think we actually get the answer to that by looking at one of the biographies of Jesus. Right? Those things we call Gospels. Right? Gospels are simply biographies of a portion of Jesus' life. And so, if we look at the Gospel according to Matthew, in other words, Matthew's account of Jesus' life, Jesus is traveling, and Matthew tells us this. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. Matthew got up and followed him. So I think the way to find that life that Jesus describes is to do what Matthew did. Follow. Recognize that we may not know how to find that way entirely on our own. Because if you think about it, that all these things we've talked about these past few weeks, and we've talked about a bunch of things these past few weeks, where we've talked about the idea of taking time to be present in our lives, consciously present, sit quietly and just be there. Or we've talked about dealing with our hurts and our pains and getting help. If we have an issue that we need help with, be willing to get help. Being willing to take time to rest, to not just go all the time. And be willing to put the effort in to find a life of purpose. I'm convinced that if we do all those things, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you believe in God or not, whether you believe in Jesus or not, if you do all those things, I'm certain your life will get better. It will be better than if you didn't do those things. But to have that life that Jesus talks about, that deep, rich, meaningful life, I think there's one more thing we have to do, and that's follow Jesus. Because just like Matthew, when Jesus invited him to follow, Jesus is inviting each of us to follow. And I'm going to kind of keep pounding on that word, follow. Because Jesus invites us to believe, but he also invites us to follow, and they are not the same thing. As we talked about, we do believe that faith in Jesus grants us what we call salvation. It leads us to eternal life, right? And that is a gift. That's something we receive simply by faith. We do nothing to earn it. But as we've talked about this life that Jesus describes, there's two parts to it. There's the eternal life part, which is faith. But there's the life here that is rich and meaningful and impactful. I don't believe you find that life just by believing in Jesus. You find that life by following Jesus. Just believing in Jesus will make a difference in your eternity. But just believing in Jesus will make no difference in the world, will make no difference in our community. If we want to make a difference in the world, we want to make a difference in our community, we have to actively follow Jesus. And all that means is lead a life consistent with the example that he laid out, right? To love others even when it's really hard, right? To serve others even when it's really hard. To invest our lives in others. That's the path to that life that Jesus describes. It's by following Jesus, not just believing in Jesus. Now, living like that can be really scary. And that kind of takes us back to the phobias that I kicked off with. Because as we think about following Jesus, a number of different fears can pop up. Now, some of the first fears that people would often share with me if I was to ask them about that was, I don't want to move to Africa. You're probably not going to need to. Some people do get called to places like Africa and other places. Most of us don't. Some people get called into full-time ministry. Most people don't. For most people, following Jesus means doing something new exactly where you are, through the life that you currently have. So, even if you've been a Jesus believer for a long time, living this life like Jesus describes is about taking action, about stepping out into our community. And I know that many of us here are out there in our communities, and I'm simply asking us to be willing to continue to do that and amp that up and be willing to do it in a bigger sense. Do it in our individual lives and do it together as a church. But that also creates challenge. Because as we step out to do new things, by definition, if they're new things, we don't actually know how to do them yet. Right? I mean, we can do all the research we want, we can look into opportunities, but the reality is that we won't know how to do all the things we need to do until we start to do them. And that creates social phobias. We're afraid that we might try and do something and it's not going to work, and everyone will know that it didn't work. And what will that mean? It means we try again, is what it means. Because I think oftentimes we're afraid that people know us, or they may know our background, and who are you to think you can do that, or you're going to try this and it's just I'm going to look silly trying to do it. And I think a lot of times that's what stops us from doing what we have the opportunity to do. Because we're so afraid we're going to fail. And guess what? Sometimes we are. Sometimes we might even fail spectacularly. And that's okay. We get up and we try again. Because the way to guarantee failure is to not try. Right? But we adjust. We go forward. There's this quote from Zig Ziglar that I absolutely love. Basically says, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Until you can learn to do it well. But the reality is that the thing that stops, I'm going to say us, and I just mean the human race, the thing that stops human beings from doing big things is the fear that you're not going to know how to do it when you start. And you're not. Right? It's that willingness to go out there doing the best you can. Because you can read books all day, you can watch YouTube videos all day, you can read blog posts all day, you can buy a manual all day. Until you're in there doing it, you don't know how. I mean, do you want surgery done on you by a guy who's watched 20 YouTube videos? No, you want the guy who's operated on some other people first, or figure it out. Right? That's the only way we do it. We do those other things too, but we get out there. And we are willing to do it poorly until we figure out how to do it well. You know, we give it our best shot. We try really hard. We don't accept less than excellence. We pursue excellence, recognizing that you've got to ramp up to do that. So, my friends, I think that to have the life that Jesus describes, that we have to be willing to step out beyond what we're comfortable with, beyond what we know how to do. And if we're not willing to make mistakes, we're never going to have the impact that we can. But if we are willing to make mistakes, we will begin to find that life that Jesus describes, that rich, meaningful, impactful life that Jesus describes. We do that by being a Jesus follower, following his example, and applying the things we see him do in our lives by serving the people around us.